Hey everybody, I wanted to give you a quick tutorial set of videos that'll help you work through this week's Period 5 DBQ practice and will hopefully be helpful for you just in general about prepping for the DBQ. So this week you are completing this Period 5 DBQ practice. It's all about the Civil War. So if you take a look at the PowerPoint that will be connected to this assignment, you will be able to see a bunch of different videos for you that will go through all of the process of prepping for the DBQ. So first things first, the first thing as always is wanting to understand the prompt. And once you are able to do that, then you can start working towards your context and your thesis. So for step number one, you want to make sure you take the time to really understand what the prompt is asking. It's oftentimes easy to just get used to reading it and seeing the topic and thinking that's it. And that's been sort of a flaw for many of you this year in your writing is you do really well at writing about the topic, but not necessarily about what the essay prompt is actually asking you to do. So you want to make sure you take this time, even if it's just a minute or two, because it'll help you figure out how to better plan your essay once you know not just what time period and topic, which is obviously very important to know. It'll help you narrow down what notes you should have out for this DBQ, but it'll also help you think about what skill you're being asked to show mastery of. And it may even help you organize your essay. So for example, last week's DBQ assignment actually gave you the fact that it wanted you to talk about the economic, political, and social aspects of something that was changing over time. So sometimes when it gives you that, by understanding the prompt, you already have an organization for yourself. So the prompt for this week is evaluate the extent to which growing sectional tensions from 1787 to 1860 caused the Civil War. Again, evaluate the extent is asking you to what degree. So in other words, you need to have some sort of qualifier. So whether you want to say sectional tensions were the main cause, or they were one of the causes, or they ultimately caused, or they greatly caused, or they had little impact on, whatever you choose, you have to have some sort of qualifier somewhere in your thesis for the reader to know. And then, of course, once you sort of understand what the prompt is asking you to do, what events, people, or concepts come to mind? And to give you a quick review, now this is just a review of Period 5 up to the Civil War. Period 5 actually also includes the Civil War and all of Reconstruction, but this prompt is specifically asking you about what caused the Civil War. So that's why I'm only covering these facts. So first and foremost, there's the issue of territorial and economic expansion. So during this era of history, after the era of good feeling, we have this whole era where America is really expanding across the Western frontier, as well as really attempting to establish its borders along its northern border and southern borders. So obviously the big issue is going to be Texas, which is eventually going to lead us to the Mexican-American War. There's also issues with Maine and trying to determine exactly where our border is between Canada and what will be the United States of America. And then, of course, on the other end of the country, we've got Oregon and the Oregon Territory. And how do we split that up? Because at the time, we were still sort of sharing it with Britain. So in the election of 1844, this is important to remember that President Polk was really fighting for the 54-40 or fight. And it was this idea of exactly where our northern border should be. And I point out this particular election, not because Polk is hugely important, but just to show that the ability to just be fighting for expansion and to show a strong sense of you have a border in mind was enough to get him elected president. Even if he didn't necessarily have as many good qualities as many of the other candidates that were running at the time. Obviously, you should know a little bit about the Mexican-American War, most notably about what happened after. So paying attention to what America got from the treaty, and then some of the decisions that were made afterwards. For example, the Wilmot Proviso, which never actually passed in Congress, but it was this idea supported by the Free Soilers, this idea that all of the territories claimed during the Mexican-American War should be completely free of slavery. Many of the Northerners really liked this. Obviously, the Free Soilers liked this. This was their entire platform. But again, it never passed. In regards to settling of the territories, it happens relatively quickly, and it does happen with the help of the United States, with the Homestead Act eventually, and the widespread expansion of railroads, as well as the fact that there's a lot of industries out there that really took off, like farming and mining, which is obviously a big one out in the West. And then we have all of these trails that are relatively regulated at that time, everything from the Oregon Trail to the Santa Fe Trail to the California Trail to the Mormon Trail. All of these trails were used to help expand our country westward. This is, of course, also the era of manifest destiny. And then we get into the debates over the new territories, and most of these obviously have to do with slavery. So part of it is the creation of new parties. We see three main new parties get created: the Free Soil Party, the Know Nothing Party, and the Republican Party. We start to see this debate over popular sovereignty and who should be allowed to decide who has the right to own slaves and who doesn't. The Missouri Compromise allowed the federal government to make that decision, but with the Compromise of 1850, we now start moving into popular sovereignty, which is this idea that the people who live in the state get to vote. So the Compromise of 1850 has to do with the state of California. That's when we here in California became a state, and we actually voted to have our state as a free state. And popular sovereignty from that point forward was going to be the new rule. The other thing from the Compromise of 1850 to pay attention to was that it did allow for the extension of the Fugitive Slave Act and actually made it quite harsher. This was also an era with the Dred Scott case. Again, Dred Scott was moved to a free state by his master and sued for his freedom. He did lose, and what it ultimately said was that the federal government accepted slavery, since now the Supreme Court said it was actually, once someone was a slave, they were a slave for life, and they had no rights as a citizen. But in response to this, we do see the expansion of the Underground Railroad. We also see a time when literature is really taking off at playing a role in the debate over slavery. So everything from Uncle Tom's Cabin, from the perspective of the North, to the impending crisis of the South from the perspective of the South. That issue of popular sovereignty is obviously going to be even more widespread with the Kansas-Nebraska Act and its resulting rebellions in Kansas, known as Bleeding Kansas. We see John Brown and Harper's Ferry, and sort of, again, this violence towards the end of slavery and this debate continuing. And the last thing, of course, that pushes everyone into the Civil War is the election of President Lincoln. So hopefully that gives you a quick recap to help you be able to do this next step. So once you understand the prompt and you've got back in your head exactly what was going on during this time period, now it's time to start working towards writing your thesis. So writing a DBQ, again, is all about using documents to support an argument or your thesis. Sometimes simply focusing your argument and coming up with a thesis, though, I know can be difficult. Remember that your thesis is an argument. It's your position on the topic, your claim about a historical event or development. So it can be written from your own sort of viewpoint, but it has to be historically defensible, meaning you have to have facts to be able to back up what you're saying. You can't just point to events and say, see, this event happened. You actually have to be able to prove that your claim is correct using those events. So again, remember the prompt is evaluate the extent to which growing sectional tensions from 1787 to 1860 caused the Civil War. Now, the events that I had in that review were very much so more in the 1800s. 1787 is important to pay attention to because that's around the time that we actually wrote and signed and ratified our Constitution. So for the thesis and the context, again, both of these should be in your introduction. I say this all year, every year, that your contextualization is most easily earned as a point if you include it in your intro. The reason why it's good to have it in the intro, other than just because it puts it front and center for the reader to find, is because it helps to provide that historical background that helps set the stage for your thesis and really the rest of your essay. And if you're able to really establish a historical background early on, it also tends to make your thesis statement stand out a lot more, and more importantly, make a lot more sense. So it needs to help the reader understand what led to the topic of the prompt. They need to know what happened before. So for example, if you saw two people fighting in the hallway at school, you would want to know why. What's the context? Think about a TV show when it starts with previously on Tiger King or whatever it is you've been watching. That's the context. You know, it's always good to see that recap. because it helps you get into the frame of mind being able to understand what that next episode is. In this case, what your thesis and what your paper is going to be about. And your thesis, finally, again, is your answer to the prompt. So that's why I've always said try and turn the prompt into a question. And that oftentimes makes it easier to write your thesis statement. And then finally, it needs to be an argument that is debatable. So you need to have a clear answer to the prompt, and you need to have some sort of reasoning. And doing that is also going to be able to help you build your body paragraphs then. So usually referencing categories such as political, social, economic, or being even more specific to that particular time period. So I'm going to show you a sample thesis. You may not use this as your thesis this week. You have to write your own. But obviously I want to give you a sample to help you out. So again, thesis, thinking about what do you already know about this topic and these documents and this time period. What is one claim you can make about how much sectional tension was a cause for the Civil War during this time? And you need to provide, of course, at least one reason. But obviously for a good thesis and a good paper, you want 2 to 3 reasons. So here's that sample thesis. I've color-coded it here for you so that you can see the different parts and it'll actually make more sense when we move into the complexity point, which is the third and final video of this series. So my sample thesis for this week is, although some historians mark the Mexican-American War and the ensuing debates about the expansion of slavery as the turning point in the path to the Civil War, sectional tensions and disagreements over states' rights, economic policy, and especially slavery dated back to the Constitution and had been growing to the point of disunion for decades before the Civil War. The recurrence of these sectional issues and the inability to solve them for decades ultimately led to disunion and the Civil War. So the reason why this thesis works is a number of reasons. One, it has a very clear claim, which is that these sectional issues and really the people's inability to solve them for the long haul was, in fact, what led to the disunion of the Civil War. I do point out that it wasn't necessarily the Mexican-American War, but in fact, long-standing issues. And by including that stuff in black, the contrary or counter argument, I'm setting myself up to be able to have that complexity point. I'm showing that I understand that some people might say this, but this is what I actually think caused the problem. You don't have to have a counter argument by any means. That isn't going to necessarily make or break your score for the DBQ, but it does help, one, really make sure that you are arguing against something. Which oftentimes makes writing easier rather than just telling a story, which is very easy to do when you have the DBQ because oftentimes all we're focused on are the documents. So you end up just spending all of your time just explaining the documents, and instead you're not actually arguing a point. But by giving yourself a counter argument to argue against, you're giving yourself something to constantly be going against, which again, like I said, is a little bit easier to argue for something then. The last part for this video is the historical context. So what is something a reader would have to know or understand about this time period in order for them to understand your claim? So for my thesis, I would want to consider including things like the constitutional issues that pointed to long-term sectionalism. So I could talk about the 3/5 compromise and even the debate over representation and the Great Compromise. I could bring up any of those very specific things, or I could wait to bring those up and just point out the fact that there was huge debates about sectional differences, even all the way back in the Constitution. And then I would want to bring up the economic issues that point to long-term sectionalism. So the fact that the North and the West were greatly helped by the market revolution, but that slavery seemed to really stick in the South because of their constant connection to farming, most notably to cash crop farming. And then, of course, I'd want to start transitioning it towards this particular time period, especially since my thesis really does start to bring up the sectional issues that come up closer to the Civil War. And just thinking about the documents, most of the documents are talking about things that happened in the 1800s themselves. So I'd want to bring up the continued debates after we began expanding. So whether those are the compromises or the Kansas-Nebraska Act or whatnot. So that's it for this video. What I want you to do is I want you to now pause and go back to the DBQ assignment and take a few moments to actually read the examples of context and thesis statements on that handout. You will find them right here, the progressive era and then imperialism. So it gives you both examples of context and explains to you why somebody would earn the point for that. And then the same thing right here for the thesis. Once you've taken a look at those, go ahead and do your context and thesis right there.